Hello, everyone. Today we're talking about Alexander Dugin and his recently translated into English book, The Theory of a Multipolar World. So, in other videos I've done on Dugin, we have seen him discuss the theory of multipolarity, but in this book and in this lecture, we have a whole section or a whole work dedicated to developing the theory of multipolarity. As of now, though, in the current stage of humanity, in our current historical episode, we are not in a multipolar world, and we really haven't been in a multipolar world since like before World War II. And after World War II, with the emergence of the ideological Cold War between Russia and the United States, we entered into a stage of bipolarity, where in the world stage or on the globe, there's two main poles of power, two main hegemons, if you will. So under that system, there were only two capitals of hegemony, and that was Moscow and Washington. But after the Cold War, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we entered into unipolarity, with America being the sole pole, the sole hegemon of the world, the only power really left. And this hegemony of the US and America and the West, generally speaking, is based off of Westernism and liberalism, with ideas such as progress, equality, freedom, universalism, and individualism. And all of these ideas are ideas which Dugin heavily criticizes in this work, but especially in his other works, and we've covered his criticisms of these ideologies, specifically in the fourth political theory elsewhere on this channel, which you can check out. But aside from the ideological issues that Dugin has with Western unipolarity, he also sees another problem in that there is no theory of international relations, or IR, that is based off multipolarity. All IR theories are essentially based on Western unipolarity. They're Western centric, and they just assume America is the unipole and go from there. But Dugin, he wants to create his own sort of international relations theory, if you will, that is based off of multipolarity instead of unipolarity. But before we go into the specifics of what the theory of a multipolar world is, let's talk about what it is not. So, the multipolar world is not just a blind negation of Western unipolarity. Although at one point Dugin does confirm that the multipolar world order is the antithesis to the unipole Western world order. But again, it's not blind negation. Dugin also wants to offer a positive critique in order to move forward. So, the theory of a multipolar world is also not just a return to an older system of IR or international relations. So, for instance, it's not a bipolar model, since it would be nearly impossible to reach bipolarity to counter Western polarity, since you would have to essentially organize the entire non-Western world, including Russia and China and India and Brazil and other countries, against the US under some ideology. And Dugin just doesn't see that happening, especially with post-modernity and with the fall of communism and the kind of disillusionment with these ideologies, generally speaking. The theory of a multipolar world also rejects the Westphalian nation-state system, which seeks full legal equality among sovereign states. And under this model of the nation-state, the Westphalian nation-state, there is nothing above the nation-state as well. So all nation-states are equal, as well as there's nothing above them. There's no unifying force or something larger than the nation-state. But Dugin rejects this because in a multipolar world, not every state is going to be equal. There's going to be inequality between states, not equality. And not every state is going to be its own pole of power either. Dugin also rejects with the theory of a multipolar world ideas such as non-polarity or multilateralism, for both of these ideas are just euphemisms for Western unipolarity. All non-polarity is the global depoliticization that replaces politics with economics and trade and resembles sort of Francis Fukuyama's end of history, where all countries simply realize the virtue of liberalism and adopt liberalism, and there is no need for a hegemon because the hegemon did what it was trying to do, as in it achieved universalism and total unipolarity. So the idea of non-polarity is just rejected outright. And then there's the issue of, or the idea of multilateralism, which is also rejected because really all multilateralism is a contrasting theory to the neoconservative model of blatant American unilateralism. So instead, multilateralism seeks to put the US as a sort of first among equals amongst nations and wants to have other countries and other allies join in on its policing of the world. But at the end of the day, it's the same unipolar scheme, it's just different aesthetics. So George Bush was very much an American unilateralist, while Obama was kind of the optics version of that, and he sought to have multilateralism with multiple countries at his side, policing the world. But George Bush would have done the same thing, for instance. He just would have had America do it itself. So now let's lay out some of the basics of multipolarity. So multipolarity is an alternative to the current state of unipolarity, a radical alternative. So instead of one pole or one hegemonic power, there's going to be multiple centers of power, multiple poles, with each pole having the ability to defend its own sovereignty on an actual material level. Each center of power is going to be independent and have the ability to go its own way. It will not be forced to accept Western ideas such as liberalism, universalism, etc. Instead, each pole is going to be able to adopt virtues, values, and philosophical systems as it seeks, and it won't be imposed upon. And I kind of stated this earlier, but again, it's not going to be based off the Westphalian system of nation states. The multipolar world can recognize nation states of the Westphalian tradition, but it's not going to recognize them as sovereign. Or in other words, they will no longer be the subject of international relations as they have been for the past couple hundred years. Instead, sovereignty is going to be shifted over to larger aggregates or coalition of states, specifically civilizations. Civilizations will become the subject of international relations under the theory of multipolarity. And Dugin is very specific here and elsewhere that his idea of civilizations is based off Samuel Huntington's proposed Clash of Civilization thesis. So Huntington wrote this thesis, this idea, which later turned into a book, after the fall of the Soviet Union, and where he had a pessimistic, from a neocon perspective, outlook for the world. So he didn't think, as his student Francis Fukuyama did, that there will be this sort of unipolarity / non-polarity. Instead, he thought that with the end of the capitalist communist tensions, or that ideological tension, there's going to be another sort of tension that's going to rise in the subtle power vacuum that the fall of the Soviet Union caused. And these new fault lines have already started to emerge, he argues, with the absence of this ideological conflict. And it's proposed, or he proposes, that this tension, this conflict, is a civilizational or cultural conflict. And he says that the reason why it's civilizational or cultural is because civilization and culture is something very deep in the human experience. And Huntington argues that nation states are going to become less important, less meaningful, as people look beyond petty nationalisms and start believing in something bigger than themselves, but not in some universalism. So an Iraqi citizen might view himself less and less with the Iraqi state, but he's not going to view himself as a citizen of the world, but more so as part of a greater Islamic civilization, as an example. So, under the civilizational multipolar model, the multipolar world is going to have as many poles or centers of power as there are civilizations. So, Dugin, and he agrees with Huntington here, says that the main civilizations, or the most obvious ones that we see today, are going to be Western civilization, which is like America and Europe, as well as some other places, perhaps in North America, as well as there's going to be the Orthodox or the Eurasian civilization, the Islamic civilization, the Hindu, and the Confucian. As well as there's a couple potential civilizations that may or may not arise because they're not as well formed as the others are, not as well established. And these will be the Japanese, the Buddhist, the Latin American, and the African civilization. And now it's here in Dugin's writings where it can be a bit confusing, because what he's doing is he's constantly switching up whether or not he's talking about how the world should be versus how the world is, or how the world is trending to. He both has a sort of ideal model of multipolarity that he wishes to construct, something he wishes the world to become, but he also at the same time generally sees the world as trending in that direction as well, while not yet completely at a multipolar stage. But in this video here, I'm going to try my best to make his ideas as simple and straightforward and organized as I can. There are two main problems that I see Dugin trying to intellectually overcome. The first is that he wants to give the concept of civilizations ontological priority to make his theory more grounded. And if this is proven, it would mean that civilization is something more than just a pure will to power or accidental construction and has grounding beyond just accidental material conditions. Civilization and culture, he'll argue, are innate to humanity and would still exist even if under a repressed form under models such as ideological bipolarity or Western unipolarity. He would argue that you can't extinguish civilizations, you can only repress it. So civilizations always exist, he's going to argue, but they just express themselves in different amounts depending on whatever international relations model is at hand. The second main issue that I see in his writing is that he also wants to develop an outline of how the multipolar world should be structured itself, rather than just simply saying that each civilization will be a pole in the multipolar world. He's trying to give intellectual weight to his theory that is rooted in philosophy and that draws upon various international relation theories, and not just try to give an outline of how he thinks the world will be in the future. He's not just trying to predict the future, he's trying to construct a philosophical basis for the future of how the world ought to be. And now I'm going to use these two problems identified as a roadmap to elaborate more on his theory. So first, we'll look at how Dugin gives an ontological basis to the concept of civilizations. So first and foremost, he defines civilization as a collective community united by belonging to the same spiritual, historical, cultural, mental, and symbolic traditions, most often religious in its roots, though not necessarily realized in terms of a concrete religion, the members of which sense intimacy towards one another, regardless of national, class, political, or ideological belonging. So Dugin then asserts that civilizations exist both empirically, from a sociological perspective, and also historically, but he still isn't really satisfied with this being an ontological justification. Dugin argues for putting the various civilizations in the Aristotelian category of substances, which thereby places the broader concept of civilization into the concept of secondary substances, again Aristotle, meaning that the concept of civilization is predicated of specific civilizations. Thus, each specific civilization has its own ontological independence and is not reliant on anything else, while the general concept of civilization is reliant on the specific civilizations. Using this model, specific civilizations can undergo changes or even remain static without ceasing to be a civilization. And then Dugin goes about in a typical fashion where, in order to give more evidence of the existence of civilization, he lays out a number of civilizational theories from a wide variety of philosophers and intellectual schools of thought, and proceeds to explain what can be taken from each of these to build a philosophical foundation of civilization. And now I'm not going to go into the specifics of each school of thought he delves into because he talks about quite a bit, but I will talk about some of the key takeaways he takes from these schools. The first thing is that he rejects Oswald Spengler's dichotomy between culture and civilization, and instead he takes the more mainstream route and makes the two terms practically synonymous. So for him, civilizational identity is constantly in flux, yet there is something constant about them that the flux doesn't change. So although civilizations might change over time, they're still going to ever remain as civilizations. Their essence isn't going to change, even though their particulars or their accidents might be changing. He's also critical of the Freudian notion of civilization, especially Freud's notion of civilization with regard to the Oedipus complex. Instead, he opts for taking Carl Jung's psychoanalytical idea of collective unconsciousness as a psychoanalytical foundation for civilization. He also cites a few other more obscure psychoanalysts as well. And then citing his own work now, specifically his work on ethnosociology, which I've done a video about and you can check out, he says that in ethnosociological terms, civilization is the stage of the Narod, where the concept of the other takes center stage and where there is social stratification. So it's not like an ethnos or like a sort of like primitive tribal society where there really isn't any hierarchy and there really isn't a concept of the other. Instead, he places civilization at the first derivation of the ethnos, of what he calls the Narod or the Laos, wherein there is the concept of the other. Civilizations have to recognize otherness because especially with the multipolar world, there's going to be a sort of clashes between various civilizations, and they have to properly recognize the other in those instances. Another important concept applied is in the Heideggerian approach. Here again, Dugin is referencing some of his own philosophical work on the subject. So for Dugin, he believes that Heidegger's concept of Dasein, which is a word that's a bit hard to define, but literally translates to being there and is essentially man as his most authentic self. Dugin takes this idea of Dasein in some of his other works and takes this idea of Dasein or being there and applies it at a collective level instead at just the individual level. Specifically on the existential level, every civilization, he argues, has its own Dasein itself, along with each person having their own Dasein. So this would give a sort of existential and ontological quality to civilization itself, where civilization has its own being, its own existential value to it. And now with all these theories of civilization stated, he fundamentally sees, drawn on Leibniz here, that each civilization is its own monad. It's its own sort of self-contained universe. Each civilization is its own universe. And each of these monads are qualitatively different from other monads, other civilizations. What you have with the multipolar world with various civilizations is you have parallel cultural universes. And this view also has some other implications because it renders humanity not as an aggregate of homogeneous or identical individuals, but rather as each Dasein, each person belonging to a particular civilization, which groups humans different from each other, which gives a qualitative difference between humans, and does not reduce every human to just some individual that's just the same as every other individual, which is the Western or liberal idea of individualism. But these are just some of the theories of civilization he applies to his theory of multipolarity as a philosophical basis. I would recommend everyone get the book. It's pretty short, and read the book because he goes into some other topics as well, which for the sake of time, I'm not delving too much into. Okay, now that we've established how Dugin gives value to civilization, gives a philosophical foundation to the idea of civilizations, we can move on to the second problem of trying to flesh out a new paradigm of international relations that supports multipolarity, but can also replace the current regime of Western unipolarity. So the starting point of this new paradigm is going to be in recognizing and identifying the West and all of its pretensions, individualism, liberalism, globalism, etc., as the core of hegemony in the world today. But instead of accepting this paradigm, as essentially all other modern IR theories do, this paradigm needs to be rejected, and we need to find a way to deconstruct Western hegemony and any other planetary model of hegemony that's proposed, even if it's non-Western. One IR theory he cites as being particularly useful here is the post-positivist school, which deconstructs Western universalism to be confined to just a historical and geographical borders and shows its claim to universality as just that, claims. Westernism to them is not in fact universal, it's only existent in the geographical area that it's in, and it is not everywhere. It's just another historical episode, if you will. Another theory Dugin is going to employ to deconstruct Western hegemony is Carl Schmitt's theory of large spaces. And now this can get a bit complicated, but I've tried my very best to make this as simple as I can for you guys. So a large space is a limited geographical area of the globe. Some examples that Schmitt gives is continental Europe or the Western Hemisphere, where a regional international law occurs in that space to control the inherently anarchistic and chaotic nature of international relations through a balance of powers in that region. So it's a legal way to unify a specific region of the Earth without just making one super state or one super regional state occur. But before you actually get these large spaces, you first have to have what Schmidt calls a preconcept. And this is a supranational idea that lacks specific legal codes, as in there's no way to currently enforce it. Some examples of this would be the idea of the Monroe Doctrine, which states that in the Western Hemisphere, there isn't going to be any European colonization, and that the United States has a right to enforce this idea with force. And another example, specifically what Schmidt was trying to conceive of when he first wrote about this idea in 1939, right before World War II, was the preconcept idea of the German Reich over continental Europe. And these large spaces are what results once these preconcepts are applied with force and actualized. And Dugin proposes that this idea of large spaces be mixed with the idea of civilizations. So for instance, a Eurasian civilization acts as a preconcept, and once it's effectualized, we can see the actual emergence of a Eurasian civilizational large space. The large space acts as the legal backbone, the legal theory that, backed by force, applies to geographical region. And this is a rejection of the Westphalian concept of the nation-state, which puts nothing above the nation-state. For under this theory of multipolarity, the large space and the legal concept it has are above the nation-state. This doesn't mean that you can't have nation-states. It just means that nation-states aren't going to be sovereign. You can still have your various countries, but there's going to be a power above them that can truly decide the exception in states of emergencies, and when push comes to shove, it's ultimately the one who's in charge, even though day-to-day administration might be administered by the nation-state. So these large spaces, this sort of imposed legal concept over a geographical region, will act as the balancing but also unifying force in each civilization. But it's not just going to act as a balance of powers within each particular civilizations, but looking at the global scale as well, we see that large spaces also act as a balance of powers between each other as well. So you have a sort of order of large spaces, which will be a global balance of powers and will contribute to maintaining global multipolarity. These large spaces, or these civilizations, each pole in the multipolar world, is going to be responsible for maintaining its own power, of making sure that other ideologies, other ideas aren't imposed on it, and that each civilization can be truly sovereign in the sense that there is nothing above the civilization. There is nothing above the large space. And each civilization will be able to choose its own path. It will be able to go its own way. It will be able to say no, for instance, to liberalism. It won't have to accept universal ideologies. So in this way, Dugin is drawing on the idea of freedom in liberalism, but it's not a freedom for the individual, but rather it's a freedom for each civilization to go its own way. But again, just because we have multipolarity doesn't mean that we're only going to have just a handful of the superstates. Rather, each civilization is going to have multiple types of power structures within it. So there could be nation states, city states, or even civilizational states such as China, as well as other institutions such as a religious institution or civic institutions of other types that exist within the civilization, but they are united culturally within each other, within their own monad, within their own universe, though. And there is something above them all, another power above them all, which makes them fundamentally not sovereign in the Schmittian sense, as in the person who gets to decide the exception. So in this way, each civilization is going to have a degree of federalism or subsidiarity to it. And the last thing I want to talk about here is that when it comes to the interaction between civilizations, there is going to be a dialogue of civilization, as Dugin calls it. There isn't going to be a super formal diplomatic way of interacting between civilizations, a super rationalistic way of interacting between civilizations as there is currently, but instead there's going to be a dialogue, and civilizations are going to dialogue in many ways. One of them is going to be war. You know, that you're going to have battles, you're going to have fights, you're going to have differences, especially between the borders of civilizations, because the borders aren't strictly defined. There is going to be some gray area. There is going to be some adjusting of the balance of power in the world. And this is all part of the dialogue of civilizations that's going to occur. But this doesn't mean to say that all dialogue is conflict, for you can have other sorts of dialogue as well, such as exchanges between peoples. You could have trade, you could have other things as well, but there's going to be a grand dialogue of civilizations across the world where each of these separate cultural universes interacts with each other in an organic way. Now, everyone, this pretty much wraps up our discussion on Dugin's theory of a multipolar world. There is quite a bit more in the book that I didn't cover, mostly because I've covered a lot of it elsewhere in, for instance, the fourth political theory. While a lot of the rest of the book is interesting, it's in a way kind of repeating what he's already said, but it still is good, and it sort of acts as a way to introduce readers, if they aren't familiar with ideas of the fourth political theory as well, because a lot of the ideas talked about in the fourth political theory are summed up in the latter half of the theory of a multipolar world. So I recommend, if you haven't got the book, I recommend you read it. And if you have read the book, I hope that this video sort of serves as a refresher or perhaps second perspective on the book. And I hope it added to your knowledge of the book and enriched your experience of the book as well. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Either leave a comment below or go to my About page and on YouTube or Odyssey, and you should see my contact there, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much.